What we want to do today is twofold. So one, how do you go back and tell yourself that you're wrong, Ben? Maybe we can start from there on O1. And how do you get some moment to retweet you and say many such cases? And then we can kind of go into the specifics of O1. But welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Yeah, we were talking about this a bit before, and yeah, I think it's actually one thing that people that are like deep in this space don't get about people that are outside the space. So I think that, a lot of us are engineers, right? So I think we're used to being on the cutting edge, and we're like excited to try stuff. At least for myself, I'm excited to keep trying stuff because like I wanted O1 to be good even when it wasn't. At least like when the first time I tried it, it wasn't good, but I wanted it to be good. So that's kind of why I kept trying. I think most people, that's not true, right? Like most people try something once, and if it doesn't work, they have this like very fixed mental model. They never try it again. So there's definitely that just kind of engineering mentality. And then I think separately, like, we work like, my company works with a lot of AI products. And so we have to have good opinions about this sort of stuff. And we also like, when we're wrong, we'll hear it from our customers just chatting with them, right? So it's like a lot of it was like, I have this tweet and like one of our customers is like, hey, actually I like it, and here's what we use it like, we're planning on using it like this in our product, etc. So that feedback loop is really fun.
What was your experience then? Did you like the model right away? Like, did you kind of, did it grow on you?
Yeah, so I think my experience with O1, where it's been different from other models for me, is that O1 is actually the first model where I'm getting more impressed by it the more I use it. So like when ChatGPT first came out, right, I think it was GPT 3.5. And at first it seemed like, oh, wow, this is amazing. It can actually create text that sounds like a human, and it can write poems. But kind of as you started to use it more, you would discover more of the things that where, there was error cases or there's areas where it wasn't capable. And with O1, it's been the opposite experience. So the more I've used it, the more impressed I become by it, and the more I realize it can do. So it's kind of like, by the nature of it is so capable, it's sort of been like pulling me towards using it more.
Are there, for either of you, any use cases that you were not able to do at all in previous models that you didn't even try at first in O1 and then you found out it was actually good? Any lessons there?
I think this is interesting. Like one thing you'll see a lot, and like even reactions to the post, is like people looking for specific examples where one is a lot better. I think Dan actually did a great job of like pulling out some of those examples. I think it's really hard because a lot of it is just like deeply specific to like I think that it generally understands the project I'm working on better, for example, and like the intricacies of how the code base is laid out. There's like, we use ClickHouse a ton. I think specifically it seems to like confuse like ClickHouse SQL syntax less, but these are very hard things to like articulate to people in an example. It's like, oh, it's like 60%, 70% better or something, which is huge.
I would love to just run through the post because I'm sure people have read it, but we can get the behind the scenes of writing it. So I think the title is the most important thing. Like O1 is not a chat model. And I think this is both from a usage perspective, but also ties back to some of the training stuff and post-training that we already talked about. Like the previous models were so focused on early chat, based on especially on chat completion, that they're great at chat and they know what to ask next. The O1 models are more goal and reward based on the post-training side. So that kind of changes how you interact. When did you first make the distinction? Is there kind of like some day that you were using the model that you were like, okay, like I just need to completely change the mental model to think about it? Or was it just kind of like, a gradual progression?
There actually was a day, and it's kind of funny. I think that I was just trying to do something over and over again, and it's obviously super long response times. Separately, I was having a bug with the ChatGPT app on my phone where like it wasn't like every time I like went to a different app, it would like stop responding the O1 response, which was like kind of silly. So I was hitting all these bugs, and so the only way to get around this bug was to just like not have to iterate with it, right? Like essentially, like I was like, I can't keep doing these back and forths because everyone takes like 5 minutes to respond, but then every time I would accidentally like do something, it was adding more time. So then I actually took the time, like not thinking about it from like like model perspective, whatever, but just because I was tired of waiting so long between iterations. And then the answer was really, really good. So that's when it clicked for me.
Did you have a similar experience then? I'm always curious, like I didn't really think through the chat. It's almost like the chat is still the UX, and I think that's what confuses people maybe. Like if you didn't have a chat interface and it was like, write a brief, I think people would maybe be steered more the right way. So I'm curious, Dan, what was your path to kind of work through that?
Yeah. So what I'm mostly doing when I'm using it is I'm using the connection feature in the ChatGPT app to connect it to Cursor or to Windsurf or to VS Code. So typically what I'm doing is it is still the chat interface, but I'm really thinking about it as like an intelligence layer over my code editor, my IDE. So, and I think for me, like at first, so I'm typically using LLMs mostly for coding use cases and like using Sonnet 3.5 and GPT-4o. I would often get like 95% of the way there with, say, implementing a complex feature. But it's kind of like in programming, if you're 95% of the way there, you're 0% of the way. Like you need to get 100% of the way there or it just doesn't work. Yeah, using O1 was the first time where I would connect it to my IDE. I would provide like, the full context of my code base. I'll just create a file that concatenates all my files into one just simple text file, give it to O1, and then say, hey, based on this code base, help me implement this feature. And it was the first time where like it could do it one shot and get me 100% of the way there. So from there, I was kind of hooked just because it works so well.
Manuel, aka Solono from our Discord, he built a tool for like a text file merging for code use cases. Has this new kind of like prompting pattern changed the way you think about prompt storage, or like do you keep a doc with like some of these like long context just to like reprompt it for like the same type of task? Or
I just keep a directory in my repo, my projects, and I just have like O1 prompt template in there. So like this weekend I put Ben's structure in there, and I'll just use the coding agent. I'll just say, hey, create me a prompt based on this input using this prompt template, and it can just generate it for you.
Ben, you want to run through the prompt template?
Yeah. Well, I don't have it in front of me right now.
Well, I'll read it out for you. So the anatomy of a O1 prompt. So you have the goal, the return format, warnings, and then context dump, which if you think about putting a ton of stuff in there, you should put 10x, whatever you think a ton is. How did that structure come to be? And maybe what are like the things that people get the most wrong in putting it together?
Yeah. I think the big thing about, and even like maybe something that I saw some people misinterpret, was like what I found that worked really well was not telling the model how to think about it, if that makes any sense. Like almost more like you're actually interfacing with a person, which is like scary in its own right. But if you're working with a like a coworker, you're not going to be like, think really like slowly about this, or think, like it's kind of patronizing, but you might say like, look out for X, look out for Y. There's this weird thing in the code base, right? Like you're going to give those sort of warnings. I think that it's trained to reason a specific way, and it's best to sort of like let it do that. I think that similarly, even things like return format, goal, it's like similar. Like instead of trying to prompt it too much on how to think, I'll kind of make sure that the return format itself lends itself to good results. So I kind of use this example, like made up an example around like hiking. Like for example, you'll see it says, return the name like you would see it on all trails, right? And it's like kind of trying to get it in the direction to like not just make up a random name, like actually try to make it, but it's a little bit less than like, telling it not to hallucinate. Like, so I think for some reason, focusing really on that return format also is really critical.
Are there bad return formats that you tried and kind of moved off of? Or, like the hiking example is one. Are there any other good or bad examples that come to mind for both of you?
I mean, interestingly, like, I think, the hiking is somewhat like a convoluted example, because again, I think it is sort of hard to have an example that actually like is sort of universally applicable to people, which is like what my goal for that. Like, I think that if I was actually looking for hiking things, well, I actually did try that prompt, and I think that something with like access to the internet actually will do better in those cases, which makes sense. I think that I talked about it a little bit there. I think that I've had a very hard time getting it to actually write stuff. I know that I've heard of people using it for writing where it's like processing diffs or like providing critiques or feedback. But at least for myself, I haven't found a good way to get it to write in a specific tone or like match my tone, for example, or really match anyone's tone. But if there is a way to do that, I would love to know.
Yeah, for me, at first I was asking it to generate full files of code, like as I'm making changes. That can get a little bit confusing. And then if you're trying to use like a coding agent to bring it over into your projects. So I feel like that's not the best format for coding use cases. And so what I started to do, which Ben alluded to, I started asking for the return format to just be a diff. So a diff only. So I only want you to give me back what I'm going to change in my files.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. It's kind of like blurring the line. The second point that you made on the post is describe what you want, not how you want it. And I think there's almost this like gap between, well, this is what I want, but I kind of want it as a code diff, you know? I'm curious, like how do you think about describing, like how much of an importance should how you want it be? I mean, going back to the tone, right? It's almost like people are so focused on, oh, I need it to be my tone, but then maybe if I can write a more compelling copy and it's not in your tone, then that's just as good, right? So how do you think about that?
That's interesting. I think the tone one for specifically, even taking a step back, I think the sort of tough part here is that even with LLMs in general, I think that, even since like, GPT-4, GPT-4.5, like there hasn't been an instruction manual. I think that, even OpenAI doesn't really have an instruction manual. Like they sort of like this thing is born and they're trying to figure it out in the same ways that we're trying to figure it out. I think that what makes O1 even trickier than other models is that there is actually an asymmetricness to how well OpenAI understands the model and how well for example, the fact that like reasoning tokens are hidden, right? So there's all this stuff happening that we actually just can't see, right? Even as developers, which is super interesting. And then also there's this whole component of like how it was trained that we're also not privy to, which is like, I think very different, it seems like, than how other sort of like what the industry standard is. So yeah, just prefacing that, I think that the tone thing is somewhat a side effect of the fact that it has all these reasoning tokens that is in a very specific like tone. It feels like a very academic tone. So I think that's where that comes from. I do think that the describing what you want part is extremely, extremely important. So for example, in Dan's example, I think that if you're trying to sort of like make changes to a production code base or like something that you're going to be maintaining, for example, you probably do want diffs. Like you want to make sure that you understand exactly what it's changing, and asking for a diff, almost a way of signaling to the model that like you don't want it to just go change a bunch of stuff. Like you want it to make sort of very measured, targeted changes. Whereas like you can imagine that if you were making like just some sort of app you wanted to spin up in it like in 2 hours, that like having it just YOLO every single file, and like just throw everything into one big file, like that could be totally fine. So I do think that like process of really critically, so exactly what Dan was alluding, that process of like really critically thinking, like what is my intent of asking this question? Like what am I trying to get out of this? It feels like more important than ever as models become more capable.